Look at any history textbook and the explanation is clean, confident, and complete. The 19th century was an era of explosive industrial growth. Populations surged. Cities expanded. Governments and private investors poured capital into railways, waterworks, civic buildings, and transit systems to meet the demands of a rapidly urbanizing world. Supply followed demand. Infrastructure followed people. That is the standard model, and for most of history it holds, until you start measuring. Not interpreting. Not theorizing. Just measuring, population figures on one side, infrastructure capacity on the other, and the numbers begin to produce a friction that the standard model does not comfortably absorb. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. Take the water systems first because they are among the most precisely documented. In 1860, the city of Philadelphia had a population of approximately 565,000 people. Its municipal waterworks, already decades old by that point, had been engineered with a distribution capacity that engineers of the era described as sufficient for a city several times that size. Not slightly oversized. Not built with modest room to grow. Several times. The Fairmount Waterworks, completed in its expanded form by the 1820s and 1830s, was celebrated internationally, not merely as a functional system, but as an architectural monument. Visitors came from Europe specifically to observe it. The question that the records quietly raise is not whether it was impressive. It clearly was. The question is who, at the time of its construction, needed that scale. Philadelphia's population in 1820, when the core infrastructure was being built out, was somewhere around 63,000 people. That is not a rounding difference. That is not a margin of growth planning. The infrastructure was not built for the city that existed. It was built for a city that would not arrive for another 40 or 50 years, in some projections longer. And Philadelphia is not unusual in this regard. It is, if anything, representative. Move to the railway networks of the northeastern United States and the pattern recurs in a different register. By 1850, the United States had more miles of operational railway track than the entirety of Europe combined. This is a figure that tends to be presented as evidence of American industriousness, and it may well be. But when population density maps from the same period are placed alongside railway routing maps, something becomes structurally strange. Significant portions of the network were laid through regions with sparse and, in some cases, almost negligible settlement. Not routes between growing cities. Routes through territories where the nearest town might hold a few hundred residents. The conventional explanation is speculative investment, laying track ahead of anticipated migration. Railroads, the argument goes, created the towns rather than serving them. There is documented evidence that this happened in some corridors. But the scale of pre-population infrastructure in certain regions exceeds what speculative models typically predict, even generously applied. Some of these rail lines required tunnels. The tunneling technology itself produces another layer of friction. The Hoosick Tunnel in Massachusetts, completed in 1876, is nearly 5 miles long. It was the longest railway tunnel in North America for decades after its completion. The project took over 20 years and cost an estimated $20 million in 19th century dollars, which translates to a figure that challenges easy comprehension even by modern infrastructure standards. It required continuous drill boring technology that was, in many respects, being developed simultaneously with the tunnel's construction. In other words, the engineering was being invented in order to complete a tunnel whose necessity, given the population and freight volumes of the region at the time, some contemporary observers openly questioned. This is documented. Contemporary critics said so in print. The friction here is not invented. It is found in the records. Pause here because the discomfort is worth sitting with. It is not that large infrastructure was built. It is that across multiple independent systems, water, rail, civic architecture, road grading, a pattern recurs in which the scale of construction precedes by significant margins the population required to justify that scale. And this pattern appears not in one city, not in one region, but across a landscape that was, by all official census records, considerably less populated than the infrastructure might suggest it was serving. This is the point at which the standard model asks for patience. Growth was anticipated. Capital was available. Engineers built for the future. These are not unreasonable responses. But anticipated growth follows curves. Infrastructure investment is typically staged. You build for where you are, you expand for where you expect to be. What shows up in certain 19th century records does not always look like staged expansion. It sometimes looks like full-scale deployment into an existing void. The civic buildings compound this further. American cities constructed in the mid to late 19th century contain, in some cases, public buildings of a grandeur that seems disproportionate not only to their contemporary population but to their geographic position. County courthouses in towns of a few thousand residents, built in neoclassical styles requiring imported stone, professional sculptors, and construction timelines measured in years. Train stations with vaulted ceilings and ornamental ironwork in cities that would not reach significant population for another generation. Again, these buildings exist. They are photographed, surveyed, and documented. Their construction costs are recorded in municipal ledgers. The question is not whether they were built. The question is why, at that scale, at that moment. One answer is civic pride and speculative optimism. Another is coordinated investment that assumed growth which, for some locations, never fully arrived. A third possibility, one that sits at the edge of what existing records can comfortably support, is that the population figures themselves, the census data, the town records, the growth estimates, may not be telling the complete story of who was already present or who had recently ceased to be. That is not a conclusion. It is a measurement problem. And measurement problems, when they repeat across independent datasets in consistent directions, tend not to remain quiet indefinitely. Begin with Britain, because Britain's records are among the most meticulously preserved in the world. The Victorian era is documented in extraordinary detail. Census data, municipal accounts, parliamentary inquiries, engineering surveys. If the infrastructure to population mismatch were a product of poor record-keeping or regional data gaps, Britain should not exhibit it. And yet, the London sewerage system, engineered by Joseph Bazalgette and largely constructed between 1858 and 1875, is one of the most cited achievements of Victorian civil engineering. Its scale is presented as a response to the Great Stink of 1858 and the chronic public health crisis of a city overwhelmed by its own population. This is accurate as far as it goes. London was densely populated. The need was real. But the system Bazalgette designed was not built for the London that existed in 1858. By his own documented calculations, he added a significant margin above projected population growth. A margin that, when examined against London's actual growth trajectory over the following decades, appears to have been set not for the expected city, but for a city considerably larger than Victorian projections anticipated. This could be engineering prudence. It probably is, in part. But prudence follows logic. And the logic of adding excess capacity to a system that already required years of political wrangling and vast public expenditure to approve, at a scale that exceeded near-term projections by a factor that contemporary engineers noted but did not publicly question in depth, that logic becomes harder to locate cleanly. Move outward from London. The railway network of Victorian Britain presents the same pressure point that American rail does, but in a more confined geography where the anomalies are harder to distribute across vast empty territories. Britain is a small island. Its population in 1850 was approximately 21 million. Its rail network by 1850 already exceeded 6,000 miles of track. By 1870, it would surpass 13,000 miles. These are not routes between major population centers only. The network penetrated into regions of Wales, Scotland, and northern England where population density was low and freight volumes were, by contemporary commercial assessments, insufficient to justify the construction costs. Numerous Victorian-era branch lines were financially troubled from the moment of their opening. This is documented in the records of early railway companies. Lines built, opened, and immediately operating at a loss because the passenger and freight demand the investors had anticipated did not materialize. Speculative overbuilding is the standard explanation, and it applies to many cases. But it raises its own secondary question. Who was authorizing, funding, and constructing infrastructure systems that were, by even the projections of the period, unlikely to be economically justified by the populations they were built to serve? The answer, when drawn from corporate records and parliamentary debates, is a combination of private capital, government subsidy, and an investment culture that prioritized network completion over near-term return. That answer is coherent, but it does not entirely resolve why the network, in aggregate, was sized as it was, when it was. Cross into continental Europe and a different dimension of the pattern becomes visible. The Haussmann renovation of Paris, carried out between 1853 and 1870, remade the city at a scale that contemporaries described as unprecedented in peacetime urban history. Hundreds of miles of new boulevards, new sewers, new aqueducts, thousands of new gas lamps, entire neighborhoods demolished and reconstructed. The official rationale was modernization, public health improvement, and the strategic desire to make mass street barricades, a feature of Parisian Revolution, architecturally impractical. Paris's population at the beginning of the Haussmann period was approximately 1 million people. The infrastructure installed during those 17 years was engineered for a city projected to reach 2 million and beyond. That projection was eventually correct. Paris crossed 2 million toward the end of the 19th century. But the investment came before the population, not after it. Entire boulevard systems, drainage networks, and public utility grids were installed into a city that, at the moment of installation, used only a fraction of their design capacity. This is the consistent structure of the anomaly, regardless of geography. Infrastructure appears at scale. Population fills it later. Sometimes within decades, sometimes over longer periods, and in certain documented cases, incompletely. The question this pattern places on the table is not dramatic. It is architectural and demographic. When you build for a population that does not yet exist, you are making an assumption about that population. You are assuming it is coming. You may be assuming it is coming from somewhere specific. And occasionally, in the most uncomfortable version of this question, you may be building for a population that was already there, and whose presence the surviving records do not fully account for. This is where 19th century census data begins to develop its own separate friction. American census records from the mid-1800s show growth curves that, in certain regions, are steep in ways that standard migration and birth rate models find difficult to fully reconstruct. Historians of demography have noted, in peer-reviewed literature, that some regional population figures appear to jump between census periods at rates that exceed the documented inputs. Recorded immigration, documented birth rates, and known internal migration combined. The gaps are not always large, but they are consistent in their direction. Population appears, in certain records, to arrive faster than the available demographic accounting can explain. This does not mean the census figures are wrong. Record keeping in the 19th century was imperfect, and undercounting was common, particularly of rural, indigenous, and immigrant populations. Demographic historians generally interpret the anomalies as products of measurement error and incomplete documentation. That interpretation is reasonable. But measurement error typically scatters in both directions, overcounting in some places, undercounting in others. When systematic gaps appear consistently in one direction, and when infrastructure scale consistently exceeds documented population in the same regions and periods, the two patterns begin to rhyme in a way that some researchers have found difficult to attribute to coincidence alone. Across the Atlantic world, the 19th century presents this recurring structure. Systems built large, populations arriving to fill them, and a narrow but persistent gap between the scale of what was constructed and the scale of what the surviving population records say was present to require it. Some researchers, examining these convergences across regions, across infrastructure types, and across decades, have begun to group them under a broader interpretive label. One that attempts to name not a proven explanation, but a category of questions that official history has not yet fully resolved. That label, and what it does and does not claim, is where this examination is heading. What the records show is a pattern. Infrastructure built at scales that exceeded documented population. Water systems engineered for cities 2 or 3 times larger than the cities that existed at the time of construction. Railway networks laid through territories where the commercial logic of the period's own investors was openly strained. Civic buildings erected in towns whose populations would not justify their grandeur for generations, if ever. Census data in certain regions showing growth curves that demographic accounting finds difficult to fully reconstruct from its documented inputs. These are observations drawn from existing records. They are not invented. They are not embellished. They are measurements that produce a consistent directional friction when placed alongside the standard explanatory model. And the standard model is not without answers. Engineering prudence, speculative capital, civic ambition, anticipated growth. These explanations are real, documented, and applicable to many individual cases. The honest position, sitting with the full weight of what the records contain, is that the standard model explains much, and leaves a residue that it does not entirely absorb. It is in that residue that a particular interpretive framework has emerged, primarily in online research communities over the past decade, and increasingly in the margins of popular historical discourse. The framework is referred to as Tartaria, or sometimes the Tartarian hypothesis. It is worth being precise about what this label represents in its current usage, because popular presentation has often collapsed a nuanced interpretive question into something far more absolute than the underlying discussion warrants. In its most careful form, Tartaria is not presented by its proponents as a named civilization in the archaeological sense, nor as a documented empire whose records have been deliberately removed from official history. Some presentations do make those claims, and those presentations move well beyond what existing evidence can support. But the interpretive core of the framework, stripped of its more dramatic elaborations, is something more modest and more interesting. It is the suggestion that the infrastructure anomalies visible in 19th century records may indicate a discontinuity, a gap between what existed before a certain period and what official historical accounts say existed. One interpretation within this framework holds that population figures from the early and mid-19th century may undercount a prior inhabitation, that certain regions of North America, in particular, may have been more densely settled before a period of significant depopulation, and that the infrastructure attributed to post-industrial construction may in some cases predate the populations it is said to have been built for. Some researchers pointing to this interpretation cite architectural details, construction techniques, stylistic consistencies across geographically distant buildings, the scale of foundations, as evidence that certain structures may be older than their official dating suggests. This is a significant claim, and it is important to be clear that it remains, at present, interpretive rather than evidenced in any way that mainstream architectural history or archaeology has found compelling. Dating methods for 19th century structures are well established. Documentary records, construction contracts, photographic evidence, engineering surveys, exist for most of the major infrastructure under discussion. The evidentiary bar for revising those records is high, and the Tartarian framework in its current form does not clear it. A second interpretation, more cautious and arguably more historically grounded, does not posit a prior civilization at all. It suggests instead that standard historical narratives may have absorbed and smoothed over a demographic catastrophe, a period of significant population loss in the early to mid-19th century, possibly from disease, possibly from other causes, that left infrastructure in place without the populations that had previously required it. Under this reading, the anomaly is not that infrastructure was built ahead of population. It is that infrastructure survived a population that partially disappeared, and was then reoccupied and attributed to subsequent construction. Some researchers pointing in this direction cite pandemic mortality records from the 19th century, which document wave after wave of cholera, typhus, yellow fever, and smallpox moving through exactly the regions where infrastructure anomalies are most visible. Population loss in certain American cities during epidemic years was significant and, in some records, striking. Whether that loss was large enough or sufficiently underreported to account for the full scale of the demographic gap is a question that existing records cannot answer with certainty in either direction. A third interpretation requires the least revision to the standard model. It holds that the anomalies are real but explainable within normal historical processes, that speculative overbuilding, engineering prudence, civic ambition, and imperfect census methodology collectively account for the directional gaps in the record. Under this reading, there is no discontinuity, no missing population, and no need for a revised framework. The friction is a product of imprecise measurement and the natural tendency of ambitious industrial-era builders to construct beyond immediate need. This interpretation is the most parsimonious. It requires the fewest revisions to accepted history. It is also, notably, the one that the anomalies themselves keep pressing against. Not because parsimony is wrong, but because the pattern, when examined across regions and infrastructure types over an extended period, maintains a consistency that parsimonious explanations find easier to address case by case than in aggregate. That is the honest position. The aggregate pattern raises a question that individual explanations resolve locally without fully dissolving globally. Tartaria, as a label, has become the container into which that unresolved aggregate has been placed. The container is imperfect. It has attracted additions, claims about architectural energy systems, about deliberate historical erasure, about global conspiracies, that are not supported by the records under discussion here and that tend to obscure the more legitimate questions the pattern raises. The word has, in some circles, become associated with its most extreme elaborations rather than its most careful ones. But the questions that made the label feel necessary to some researchers are not resolved by criticizing the label. The infrastructure exists. The population figures exist. The gap between them exists. And the historical record, precise and extensive as it is in many respects, has not yet produced an explanation that makes that gap invisible from every angle of examination. What remains at the end of this survey is not a conclusion. It is a measurement. A persistent, directional, geographically distributed measurement that the standard model absorbs imperfectly and that alternative frameworks address speculatively. The distance between those two imperfections is where the question lives. And it has not stopped living there.